Silence in a gunfight isn't peaceful. It's terrifying. One moment you're dominating the range, and the next, your rifle is nothing more than a heavy paperweight. That's when the noise stops, the cold sweat starts, and you find out exactly what kind of operator you really are. The Imperial Valley does not care about your resume. It does not care about the trident pinned to your chest, and it certainly does not care about the congressional hearings, the press releases, or the glass ceilings shattered to get you here. At 110 degrees, the California desert is a great equalizer. It bakes the sweat into your combat shirt until it feels like cardboard. It drives fine, alkaline dust into the action of your rifle, into your eyes, and down into your lungs. Iris wiped a streak of carbon and sweat from her forehead with the back of a gloved hand. She stood at the ready line, staring down range. The steel silhouettes at 50, 100, and 200 yards shimmered in the heat distortion. "Shooter ready," Chief Davies barked, the electronic shot timer gripped in his right hand like a detonator. Iris didn't nod. She didn't speak. She just leaned forward, driving her weight into the balls of her feet, her thumb resting lightly on the safety selector of her Mark 18. She was tired, not the kind of tired that a good night's sleep fixes. This was a deep, marrow-level exhaustion. It had been 18 months since she had walked across the grinder, the first woman to make it through the pipeline, earn the pin, and get assigned to a Tier 1 team. The media had their field day. The politicians took their photos. And then everyone went home, leaving Iris to the reality of the teams. The reality was that proving herself didn't end at graduation. It started over every single morning. Every time she stepped onto the range, every time she roped out of a helicopter, every time she cleared a room in the shoot house, there was an invisible audience. Her teammates didn't overtly sabotage her. They were professionals. But they watched. God, they watched. They watched the way she carried her kit. They watched her split times on the targets. They watched to see if the gear was too heavy, if the recoil was too much, if she would ask for a break. They were waiting for the crack, not out of malice necessarily, but out of a rigid Darwinian instinct to protect the integrity of their brotherhood. If she couldn't keep up, someone could die. That was the math. Stand by. Beep. Iris's rifle came up in a fluid arc. Snap. Bang. Bang. 2 rounds into the 50-yard steel. The dull ping-ping echoed across the berms. She dropped to a knee, driving the muzzle through the lowest port of the plywood VTAC barricade. It was an awkward, twisted position. Her plate carrier dug into her ribs. She found the 100-yard target through her holographic sight. Bang, bang, ping-ping. Clean hits, fast. She breathed out, a short, controlled hiss, and shifted to the right side of the barricade, dropping flat on her stomach for the 200-yard shot. The dirt was hot enough to burn bare skin. To her immediate right, in the next lane, Hayes was running the same drill. Hayes was a ghost of a man. 6'2", built like a brick wall, with eyes that always seemed focused on something 1,000 yards away. He was a veteran of more deployments than Iris could count, and he rarely spoke. While the other guys engaged in the brutal, affectionate banter of the locker room, Hayes just did his job. He hadn't voted for her to be there, and he hadn't voted against her. He treated her with the exact same indifferent, cold professionalism he offered everyone else. Hayes's rifle was a staccato rhythm of violence next to her. Bang, 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 bang. Flawless cadence. Iris pushed herself off the dirt, sprinting toward the second barricade 10 yards downrange. Her lungs burned. The weight of her helmet pressed down on her neck. 30 sets of eyes on her back. Davies trailing her, watching the timer. Don't slow down, don't breathe heavy. She threw herself behind the second piece of cover. This was the hard part. Transitioning targets while moving through awkward cover, fighting the weight of the gun and the fatigue in her shoulders. She slammed the handguard of her rifle against the wood, resting it to stabilize her shot. She flipped the safety off, found the crosshairs on the steel, and pressed the trigger. Click. It wasn't a bang. It was the sickening, hollow sound of a dead trigger. Time dilates when things go wrong. A single second stretches into an hour. Iris's brain processed the click before her body could fully react. She didn't freeze. Training overrode panic. Tap, rack, bang. She slammed the palm of her left hand into the bottom of the magazine to ensure it was seated, grabbed the charging handle and ripped it back to eject the bad round and load a fresh one. The charging handle only moved an inch before it locked solid. It felt like it was welded to the receiver. Oh no. She tilted the weapon up, looking into the ejection port. It was a bolt override. A fired brass casing had somehow flipped backward and jammed itself violently between the bolt carrier group and the charging handle. It was the worst possible malfunction you could get on an AR platform rifle. It tied the gun up completely. You couldn't shoot it, and you couldn't easily clear it. The clock was running. Tick, tick, tick. Malfunction, Davies noted aloud, his voice flat, neutral. He didn't offer advice. He just stood there, the timer in his hand, letting her drown. The guys on the bleachers behind the ready line shifted. Someone muttered something. Iris couldn't hear the words, but she felt the shift in energy. Here it is. The gear is failing. Let's see how she handles the pressure. Iris dropped to her knees behind the barricade. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stripped the magazine out of the gun, letting it fall into the dirt. She needed to lock the bolt back, but the jammed casing wouldn't let the bolt move far enough. She drove her fingers into the ejection port, ignoring the searing heat of the metal, trying to pry the crushed brass casing out. It wouldn't budge. It was mashed tight into the gas key. "Come on," she whispered, a harsh, jagged sound. She stood up, gripping the charging handle, and slammed the buttstock of the rifle into the hard desert dirt, trying to mortar the gun, using the inertia to force the bolt back. Smack. Nothing. Smack. Still locked. The timer kept running. 5 seconds lost. 10 seconds. In a gunfight, 10 seconds was a lifetime. People died in 10 seconds. Desperation clawed at the edges of her vision. If she timed out on this drill, she failed the evolution. If she failed the evolution, it went in her jacket. Another data point for the guys who thought she didn't belong. She panics under pressure. She can't keep her weapon running. Next to her, the firing stopped. Hayes had finished his drill. His final 2 shots rang out. The steel pinged in submission, and he lowered his weapon. He pressed the magazine release, caught the magazine in his left hand, and racked the bolt back, ejecting the chambered round. He safed the weapon and let it hang on its sling. He looked over at Iris. She was sweating profusely now. Her knuckles were bleeding where she had scraped them against the sharp edges of the Picatinny rail. She was winding up to mortar the rifle a 3rd time. Her jaw set so hard, her teeth ached. Hayes didn't look at Davies. He didn't look back at the bleachers. He took 2 long strides across the dusty gap separating their lanes. Iris saw his shadow fall over her and froze, looking up. Was he going to tell her to step off the line? Was he going to report a safety violation? Hayes didn't say a word. He reached up, unclipped his rifle from his 2-point sling, and held it out toward her. It was a customized M4. The finish was worn away to bare aluminum on the high spots. It was slightly heavier than hers, outfitted with a different stock and an expensive low-power variable optic. Iris stared at it for a fraction of a second. "Try mine," Hayes said. His voice was a low rumble, completely devoid of pity or drama. He didn't hand it to her like a lifeline. He held it out the way a carpenter hands a hammer to another carpenter when theirs breaks. The job wasn't done, the targets were still standing, and he had a working tool. That was the entirety of the transaction. Iris looked into his eyes. There was no condescension there. No, "let me save you," just a quiet, unyielding expectation. "Shoot the targets, Miller." She didn't hesitate. She let her jammed rifle drop against her chest on its sling, reaching out with blackened, bleeding hands to take his weapon. Hayes stepped back immediately, clearing her line of sight, crossing his massive arms over his chest. Iris didn't have time to adjust to the different weight. She didn't have time to find the perfect cheek weld on his stock. She ripped a fresh 30-round magazine from her belt, slammed it into the magwell of Hayes's rifle, and hit the bolt release with the heel of her hand. Clack! The bolt slammed home. She pivoted back to the barricade, driving the muzzle through the port. The trigger was different. Lighter, a glass rod snapping under pressure. The optic was set to a different eye relief. Her brain processed these foreign variables in milliseconds and discarded them. She focused entirely on the reticle and the steel. Bang, bang, ping-ping. She moved. Fluid, aggressive, fueled by a sudden electric surge of adrenaline. She hit the final port, dropping to an awkward squat to engage the 200-yard steel. Bang, bang, ping-ping. "Time!" Davies yelled. The echo of the gunfire rolled away across the valley, leaving behind the ringing in their ears and the smell of burnt cordite. Iris lowered the rifle. She flicked the safety on. Her breathing was heavy, pulling the hot, dusty air into her lungs in ragged gasps. She looked down at the rifle in her hands. It was warm. It felt completely alien, yet it had just saved her. She turned around. The guys on the bleachers were dead silent. No one shifted, no one muttered. They were staring at Hayes. Sharing a primary weapon on a qualification drill was technically against the rules. You ran what you brought. If your gun went down, you transitioned to your sidearm, or you failed the stage. But Hayes was an institution. He was the most lethal guy in the platoon, maybe the whole squadron. If Hayes gave you his rifle, you didn't question it. And if Davies saw it, he chose to ignore it. Davies looked at his timer. He clicked a button, his face impassive. "Clean run. Time is 32 seconds. You passed, Miller." Iris exhaled, a long, shuddering breath. She pressed the magazine release on Hayes's rifle, catching her mag, and racked the bolt to clear the chamber. She locked the action open and turned to face him. Hayes was still standing there, arms crossed, face like carved stone. She walked over to him, holding the rifle out. "Thanks," she said, her voice raspy from the dust. Hayes took the rifle back. He snapped it onto his sling, let it drop against his chest, and looked her dead in the eye. "Your trigger pull is still jerking right on the deep targets," he said quietly. "Fix your grip." He turned and walked back to the ready line. Iris stood there in the blistering heat. A small, involuntary smile cracked the dirt on her face. He hadn't told her good job. He hadn't asked if she was okay. He had critiqued her mechanics. For the first time since she arrived at the teams, she didn't feel like a science experiment. She felt like a shooter. The armory smelled like solvent, sweat, and stale coffee. It was a windowless concrete bunker tucked beneath the main squadron building, lined with steel cages and workbenches, scarred by years of vice grips and spilled chemicals. Iris sat at the far end of the longest bench. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed a high, irritating pitch that drilled into the base of her skull. She had her Mark 18 completely disassembled. the upper and lower receivers separated, resting on a stained green rubber mat. Her knuckles were wrapped in white medical tape. They throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache every time she pressed the wire brush against the bolt carrier group. The jammed brass casing was sitting on the corner of the mat. It was mangled, torn at the rim by the extractor, crushed in the middle where the bolt had tried to force it into the chamber. It looked like a chewed-up piece of gold foil. She kept it there as a reminder, a monument to the exact second she almost washed out in front of the entire platoon. Footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. Iris didn't look up. She kept scrubbing the carbon off the gas rings. "You're going to strip the finish right off that bolt if you keep scrubbing it like that." It was Cole. He was a breacher, a guy whose primary job was solving complex problems with C4 and a sledgehammer. He dropped a canvas gear bag onto the bench across from her. He pulled out his own rifle and began breaking it down. "Just making sure it's clean," Iris said flatly. "It's metal, Miller. Not a frying pan," Cole muttered. He grabbed a bottle of CLP lubricant and squirted a generous amount onto a rag. He paused, looking over at the mangled brass casing sitting on her mat. He picked it up, holding it between his thumb and index finger, rotating it under the harsh light. "Bolt override," Cole said. "Nasty one too. Extractor tore the rim to shit." "Yeah," Iris said. She didn't offer excuses. Excuses were blood in the water. Cole tossed the casing back onto her mat. It bounced with a dull clink. "Takes a lot of bad luck to get a malfunction like that on a timed run. Takes even more luck to have a guy like Hayes hand you his gun instead of watching you drown." Iris stopped scrubbing. She looked up. Cole was wiping down his charging handle, not making eye contact. "I didn't ask him to," Iris said, her voice tightening defensively. "No one said you did," Cole replied, his tone infuriatingly calm. "If you had asked, he would have let you stand there until the timer ran out. You didn't quit. You were about to beat that rifle against the dirt until the stock snapped. That's why he stepped in." Cole looked up then. His eyes were tired, ringed with the same chronic fatigue that infected everyone in the room. "Look, nobody cares about the politics, Miller. Nobody cares what the brass in Washington wants this team to look like. We care about what happens when the gear fails, the radios go dead, and someone is bleeding out in a ditch. We just needed to know what you do when the script gets thrown out." He threw a clean rag across the bench. It landed over the mangled brass casing. "You improvise," Cole said. "Good to know." Iris looked at the rag, then back at Cole. He was already reassembling his weapon, the metallic clack-clack of the parts locking together, filling the quiet space. It wasn't a parade. It wasn't an apology for the months of cold shoulders. It was an acknowledgement, a millimeter of ground conceded. 15 minutes later, Hayes walked into the armory. The atmosphere in the room didn't change, but it shifted. The low murmur of conversation between a few guys in the back corner quieted down. Hayes walked directly to the cage, checked out a fresh cleaning kit, and walked over to the bench. He took the empty stool next to Iris. He didn't say hello. He didn't acknowledge her tape-wrapped knuckles. He unzipped his rifle bag and pulled out the M4 she had used on the range. Iris watched him out of the corner of her eye. She watched him pop the takedown pins. She watched him pull the bolt carrier group out. "I owe you a deep clean on that," Iris said. The words felt heavy in her mouth. "I ran it hot." Hayes didn't look up from his work. He took a dental pick and began meticulously scraping a tiny buildup of carbon from the extractor claw. "You ran it like you were supposed to," Hayes said, his voice a low gravel drag. He paused, setting the dental pick down. He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out a small black plastic zip tie. He slid it across the rubber mat until it bumped against her forearm. Iris looked at it. It was a heavy-duty cable tie. "Loop it through the hole in your charging handle," Hayes said. "Leave an inch of slack. Next time you get a bolt override, you don't mortar the gun right away. You hook your index finger through the zip tie loop, yank it back hard to take the tension off the bolt, and rake the jam out through the ejection port with your Leatherman." Iris stared at the small piece of plastic. It was a hack. A dirty, unauthorized, field-expedient trick that wasn't in any manual. It was the kind of knowledge that only existed in the heads of men who had spent thousands of hours figuring out how to cheat failure. It was tribal knowledge. She picked up the zip tie. She looked at Hayes, but he was already back to scrubbing his bolt, his face an unreadable mask of focus. "Got it," Iris said softly. She threaded the plastic through her charging handle, pulling it tight and trimming the excess. She racked her weapon, the bolt sliding forward with a satisfying, heavy thud. It wasn't just a fixed rifle anymore. It was a step across the line. 6 months later, the California desert was a distant memory, replaced by the suffocating, humid dark of a nameless valley in the Horn of Africa. There was no electronic shot timer here. There was only the heavy, rhythmic thumping of the MH-60 Black Hawk rotors beating against the thick night air. The helicopter cabin was bathed in the eerie, washed-out green glow of their night vision goggles. Iris sat near the open door, her legs dangling into the black void below. The wind tore at her uniform. Her Mark 18 was slung tight across her chest, a loaded magazine seated perfectly. The zip tie loop on the charging handle, a small tactile reassurance against her gloved hand. They were hitting a compound, high-value target. The intelligence was messy, the timeline was rushed, and the knot in Iris's stomach was tied tight. She looked across the cramped cabin. Hayes sat directly opposite her. Cole was to her left. Davies was near the cockpit, holding up a single finger. 1 minute. The helicopter banked sharply, dropping out of the sky like a stone. The sudden loss of altitude pushed Iris's stomach into her throat. She gripped the edge of the doorway. The wheels hit the dirt hard. Dust immediately completely enveloped the chopper in a choking brown cloud. "Go, go, go!" Iris launched herself out of the door, her boots hitting the uneven, rocky ground. She immediately pushed out of the rotor wash, finding her sector of fire in the dark. The infrared laser from her rifle cut a solid beam through the swirling dust. They moved like water, silent, fluid, flowing over the terrain. The compound was a cluster of mud brick buildings surrounded by a high wall. There was no chatter on the radio. They didn't need it. Every man and woman knew exactly where to be. Cole moved up to the metal gate. He placed a linear charge against the hinges, unspooling the detonation cord as he backed away. He squeezed the clacker. The explosion was a concussive punch to the chest. The gate folded inward, tearing off its mounts in a shower of sparks and dust. Hayes was the first man through the breach. Iris was second. They flowed into the courtyard. The silence was broken instantly. A heavy machine gun opened up from a second-story window in the main building. The incoming tracer rounds were bright red streaks tearing through the dark, snapping over their heads with the terrifying sound of tearing canvas. Crack, crack, crack. "Contact front!" Davies yelled over the comms. Sparks showered the dirt as rounds chewed into the mud wall directly to Iris's left. She dropped to a knee, raising her rifle. She found the muzzle flash in her optic. She pressed the trigger. Bang, bang, bang. She poured fire into the window, suppressing the gunner. Beside her, Hayes was doing the same. "Moving!" Cole shouted, breaking cover to sprint toward the main door of the building. He didn't make it halfway. The door kicked open before Cole could reach it. Two fighters stepped out into the courtyard, raising AK-47s. It happened in a fraction of a second. Cole was caught in the open, completely exposed. Hayes shifted his aim to the doorway, pulling the trigger. Click, Iris heard it over the chaos. It was the exact same sickening sound she had heard in the desert 6 months ago. A dead trigger. A malfunction. Right at the worst possible moment. Hayes didn't panic. He immediately dropped to one knee, yanking his primary weapon down to transition to his sidearm. But drawing a pistol takes time. Even for Hayes, it took a full second. Cole didn't have a second. The fighters were already raising their weapons. Iris didn't think. Training, muscle memory, and a desperate, violent instinct took over. She stepped out from behind her cover, exposing herself entirely to the courtyard, placing her body between the fighters and Cole. She brought her MK-18 up. She didn't look through the optic. She drove the weapon forward, pointing it purely by feel, her focus locked entirely on the threat. Bang, bang. Bang, bang. Her rifle roared. The brass ejected in a frantic, shimmering arc in the moonlight. The first fighter dropped instantly, struck in the chest. The second fighter flinched, his burst of fire going wild, sparking harmlessly off the ground near Cole's feet. Iris didn't stop. She pushed forward, closing the distance, walking her fire right into the second fighter until he collapsed against the doorframe. The courtyard went dead silent. The heavy machine gun in the window above had gone quiet. Iris stood in the open, her rifle still raised, sweeping the dark corners of the courtyard. Smoke drifted from the barrel of her weapon. Her heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to crack her ribs. "Clear," she rasped, her voice tight. Cole scrambled backward into cover, breathing heavily. "Good hits, good hits." She turned slightly. Hayes was kneeling in the dirt, his pistol drawn, scanning the upper windows. He looked down at his jammed rifle. It was a double feed, nasty but fixable. He cleared it rapidly, holstering his pistol and bringing his M4 back up. He stood up, walking past Iris toward the doorway she had just cleared. He didn't stop. He didn't say thank you. He didn't ask if she was okay. But as he passed her, his shoulder bumped deliberately, heavily against hers. It was a brief, solid impact. "Cover my 6, Hayes rumbled over the radio. "Moving," Iris replied. She fell in behind him, raising her weapon, her boots crunching over the broken glass and spent brass. They stepped into the dark hallway together. She wasn't the woman who made history anymore. She wasn't the science experiment, the political pawn, or the headline. She was just the shooter in the stack. She was the one holding the line. And as she followed Hayes into the pitch black of the compound, the weight of the rifle in her hands didn't feel heavy at all. True respect isn't handed out in press conferences or written into policy. It's forged in the dirt, earned through calluses, failure, and the quiet refusal to quit when the odds are stacked against you. In the teams, the only currency that matters is reliability when the world goes dark. If this story of grit, resilience, and earned brotherhood hit home for you, drop a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more deep dive narratives.